Do you see this red stamp on my tablet? No authorization. That isn't just a system error. It's a death sentence for a $5 billion dream. Right now, 3 rockets are sitting on the launch pad, fully fueled and ready for liftoff, while the entire world watches the live stream. But there is a massive problem. Their onboard computers are dead. They are waiting for a signal that only one person in the world can send. And that person isn't the CEO, nor is it his team of top-tier engineers. That person is me. My former boss, Marcus, thought he was the smartest man in the room. He fired me yesterday, right before the biggest launch of my life, just to avoid paying the equity stake I spent 6 years earning. He had security escort me out of the building like a criminal, convinced his new team could handle my code within hours. He viewed me as a replaceable asset, a tiny cog in his massive machine. But Marcus made a fatal mistake. He thought my code was just a set of symbols he could steal. He had no idea I built a dynamic license into the very core of the Alloy K navigation kernel. This isn't a bug or a virus, it's an intellectual padlock. Right now, he is in mission control, pale as a ghost, because every monitor in the room is displaying my digital signature instead of telemetry. He might own the corporation, he might have the fuel, and he might have thousands of employees. But he forgot that the right to fly isn't something you buy. It belongs to the person who built the path. Time is bleeding him dry. Every minute they sit on that pad costs him millions in penalties, and Astra X's reputation is evaporating in front of a global audience. He's staring at those blank screens, finally realizing that he can own all the hardware in the world, but without my permission, it will never leave the ground. I'm looking at this tablet and smiling, because today Marcus is going to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. I am the key to the stars. And today, those stars are closed for business. I spent 6 years of my life breathing life into the Alloy K navigation kernel. It wasn't just software, it was the nervous system of every rocket standing on that pad. When we signed the original contract, I was promised a 10% stake in every commercial launch and total control over the patents. But the moment the government contracts were finalized, Marcus suddenly developed amnesia regarding our deal. He looked me in the eye and declared that my entire life's work belonged to the company and that I was nothing more than a replaceable contractor whose expiration date had arrived. I was marched out of the office through the back door, humiliated, while security hovered over me like I was a common thief. I wasn't even allowed to grab my personal belongings. Marcus watched from his glass office with that signature, arrogant smirk, convinced he had won. He thought he had successfully stolen my brain for free and could now enjoy the glory while I disappeared into a line at the unemployment office. But Marcus was never an engineer. He was just a greedy manager who didn't understand the fire he was trying to hold. He had no clue about the creator's clause I had hard-coded into the very architecture of the system. The navigation kernel requires an hourly digital handshake with a secure certificate that doesn't exist on the company's servers. It lives right here, on this tablet I'm holding. It is my digital Doberman, and it just felt a stranger's hand on the system's throat. While Marcus was busy celebrating his victory with champagne, his greatest pride was quietly turning into a $5 billion pile of useless titanium. Now, his team of expert engineers is frantically trying to bypass my encryption, but every move they make only locks the system deeper. They are trying to outplay a grandmaster without even knowing the rules of the game. Marcus thought he stole my work, but all he really stole was a ticking time bomb, and I just pressed the start button. The time for professional courtesy ended the second security touched my shoulder. Now, it's time for the bill to come due. The launch window was closing in exactly 15 minutes. Every second the rocket sat idle, Marcus was losing $200,000 in breach of contract penalties. My encrypted line finally rang, and he was screaming before I even said hello. All that corporate bravado had evaporated, replaced by the raw, unadulterated panic you see in his eyes today. He wasn't the titan of industry anymore. He was just a desperate man watching his fortune evaporate in real time. I didn't scream back. I just let the silence hang, forcing him to hear the chaos of his own failing mission control in the background. "Marcus," I said, my voice as cold as deep space. "You told me I was replaceable. So, replace me. Write a new kernel in the next 14 minutes, or admit that without me, you're just a man standing in a very expensive room." He started bargaining, offering me my original 10% plus a generous bonus to unlock the system. I just leaned back and watched the fuel pressure indicators on my secondary monitor. The 10% was the price of my loyalty, Marcus. You burned that bridge. Now you're paying for my mercy, and the price just went up. My terms were absolute and non-negotiable. I demanded a 51% controlling stake in Astra X, his immediate resignation, and the legal transfer of every single navigation patent to my private holding company. He called me insane. He called me a saboteur. I just watched the countdown clock tick toward the point of no return. 10 minutes left, Marcus. At 9 minutes, the cooling systems will cycle down, and you'll have to scrub the launch entirely. That's a $5 billion failure on your resume. Is your pride really worth that much? I heard him break. The sound of his pen hitting the digital signature pad was the most satisfying noise I've ever heard. He realized that I wasn't just an employee he could discard. I was the foundation his entire empire was built upon. By trying to save a few million in equity, he had handed me the keys to the entire kingdom. He signed the documents, the legal transfer hit my inbox, and only then did I tap the authorize button on my tablet. For the first time in history, a CEO didn't just lose a launch. He lost his entire world to the person he underestimated. The news of the frozen launch hit the stock market faster than the rockets could ever fly. While Marcus was busy begging me on the phone, Astra X's stock price was in a free fall, dropping 40% in a single hour. The board of directors, who had previously cheered Marcus on for cutting costs by firing me, were now seeing billions of dollars in market cap vanish in real time. They weren't just angry, they were terrified. They started realization that if those rockets didn't launch within the window, the company's biggest government contract would be voided by morning, and they would all be personally liable for the fallout. Marcus tried to lie to them. He told the board it was a temporary technical glitch, and that his new team was minutes away from a fix. But I wasn't just sitting at home watching the news. I was sending a CC'd email to every major board member and the company's lead underwriters. I attached the original Alloy K licensing agreement alongside a cease and desist order from my legal team. I made it clear. The rockets weren't broken, they were stolen property. I told them that any attempt to bypass my security would be treated as a federal crime under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. The silence in the mission control room must have been deafening when the board chairman walked in and demanded to see Marcus's phone. They saw the no authorization stamp on the big screens and realized they weren't dealing with a technical bug. They were dealing with a legal landmine. Marcus's arrogance had blinded him to the fact that you can't fire the person who owns the foundation of your company. He had spent years building a house of cards, and I had just pulled the bottom card out from under him. By the time the countdown hit T-minus 12 minutes, Marcus wasn't just fighting me. He was fighting his own board. They were screaming for his head, realizing that his attempt to save a few million in equity had just put the entire $5 billion firm on the verge of bankruptcy. I watched the live feed from a hidden camera in the control room, seeing him pull at his hair, looking exactly like he does in that photo, shattered and desperate. He wasn't a CEO anymore. He was a liability that everyone was trying to get rid of before the ship sank. Marcus thought he could play dirty, so I played by the book, the big, heavy federal book. While he was frantically trying to get his yes-men engineers to find a backdoor into the Alloy K kernel, my legal team was already filing for an emergency injunction in federal court. I didn't just lock the software, I locked the entire facility. I had evidence that Astra X had intentionally bypassed safety protocols to hide the fact that they no longer had a valid license for the navigation system. This wasn't just a business dispute anymore, it was a matter of national security and public safety. The FAA and the Department of Transportation were alerted within minutes. Because the Titan 1 rockets were carrying sensitive government satellites, the moment they heard the software was unverified and legally contested, they issued an immediate grounding order. Marcus was standing there screaming at his monitors when the federal agents literally walked into mission control and told him to step away from the console. The look of pure, unadulterated terror on his face was worth more than any paycheck he ever stole from me. He realized that by trying to screw me over, he had invited the federal government into his backyard to perform an autopsy on his career. He tried one last desperate move. He ordered his security team to seize my private servers, thinking he could just take the encryption keys by force. But I was 3 steps ahead. The moment his team touched the perimeter of my data center, a dead man's switch was triggered. It didn't delete the code. That would be illegal. Instead, it moved the primary authentication hub to a secure offshore cloud that was completely out of his reach. Now, even if he threw me in jail, the rockets wouldn't move an inch. He had zero leverage, and every second he spent fighting me, the fines from the government were doubling. I sent him one final text message while he was being questioned by the federal marshals. "The rockets stay on the ground until I'm the one standing in your office, Marcus. Check your inbox for the transfer papers." I wasn't just a developer anymore. I was a wall he couldn't climb over. He had spent his whole life thinking that money could buy him a way out of any problem, but he finally met someone who valued justice more than his dirty cash. The legal cage was locked, the key was in my hand, and the only way out was for him to surrender everything. As the countdown clock hit T-8 minutes, the atmospheric pressure in that room wasn't coming from the rockets. It was coming from the investors. Major venture capital firms and institutional banks had poured billions into Astra X based on the promise of a flawless launch. Now, they were watching their portfolios go up in smoke in real time. My inbox was flooded with messages from the very people who used to ignore my emails. They weren't asking for a fix anymore. They were asking for a miracle, and they knew I was the only person who held the wand. The lead investor, a man known for being even more ruthless than Marcus, personally called the control room on a secure line. He didn't even talk to Marcus. He demanded to speak to me. He realized that Marcus's ego had become a $5 billion liability. The investors weren't loyal to Marcus. They were loyal to their money. They told him, in no uncertain terms, that if he didn't resolve the licensing issue immediately, they would sue him into the Stone Age for breach of fiduciary duty and fraud. Marcus was being squeezed from both sides, by the law he tried to circumvent and the money he worshipped. He tried to stall, but the board had already held an emergency vote. They stripped him of his decision-making power right there in front of his staff. He was still standing in the room, but he was a ghost. He watched as his own directors began pleading with me to save the company. I told them the same thing I told Marcus. The price of the fix is the entire company. I wasn't going to settle for a payout or a seat at the table. I wanted the table, the chairs, and the building they stood in. I wanted Marcus Thorne gone, not just from the office, but from the industry. The final straw broke when the company's insurance carrier notified them that their policy was being voided due to intentional negligence. That was the end of the line. Without insurance and without a license, the rockets were now illegal hazards. Marcus slumped into his chair, his head in his hands, looking exactly like a man who had gambled his soul and lost. He realized that in the world of high-stakes tech, the person who writes the code is the one who truly holds the power. The investors had turned their backs on him, the board had abandoned him, and I was the only one left standing. At T-4 minutes, Marcus finally broke. He signed the electronic transfer documents with a trembling hand, officially surrendering his majority stake and resigning as CEO. The legal confirmation hit my screen, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt the weight of his ego lift off my shoulders. I didn't celebrate. I just went to work. I entered the master override sequence, and across the globe, millions of viewers saw the red error messages on the Astra X livestream vanish, replaced by a steady, pulsing green. Systems ready. License verified. The roar of the engines ignited at exactly T-0. I watched from my home office as the Titan I fleet pierced the clouds, carrying my code into the stars. It was a flawless launch, but the real victory wasn't in the sky. It was in the headlines that broke an hour later. Marcus Thorne wasn't just gone, he was erased. By the time the rockets reached orbit, I had already initiated a full rebrand. Astra X was dead. In its place, I founded Ether Alpha, a company where the creators own the vision and the suits answer to the architects. Marcus tried to slink away with a golden parachute, but I had one last surprise waiting in the fine print of his resignation. Because he had admitted to intentional negligence and licensing fraud to get the rockets off the ground, his insurance indemnity was void. He spent the next year selling his private jets and mansions just to pay the federal fines and the mountain of lawsuits from disgruntled investors. He thought he could steal my life's work and leave me with nothing, but he ended up being the one standing on the street with a cardboard box, watching my rockets fly overhead. My name is Costa, and I am now the youngest female CEO in the aerospace industry. I still keep a screenshot of Marcus's face from that final minute in mission control. The look of a man who realized too late that you should never underestimate the person who built your foundation. He thought I was just a girl who wrote code. He didn't realize I was the one who controlled the gravity of his entire world. This was my nuclear revenge. And for everyone out there being told they are just an employee, remember, you are the architect. Hold on to your keys. Thanks for watching Unsaid Stories, and I'll see you at the next launch.